Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation, Signs and Wonders, the Shared Story of Passover and Easter. My name is Ed Hannenberg. I'm the Breen Chair in Catholic Theology and Chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at John Carroll University. And I'm here to thank you for joining us this evening for what we hope is just the beginning of a series of online opportunities to reach out beyond the borders of campus and even of Cleveland, to draw folks like you into some of the conversations, some of the interfaith engagement happening here at John Carroll. Tonight's presentation is made possible by the TUI Endowment in Interreligious Studies, which was established in 1966 in honor of the late Walter and Mary TUI, and which has proven to be a real incubator of interreligious work at John Carroll, helping to sponsor courses, conferences, and all kinds of conversations involving the great religious traditions of the world: Catholic Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism. And in fact, to build on that history, the university has committed to raising a new endowment for a chair in Jewish studies in order to create a permanent home on campus for the study of Judaism and Jewish-Christian dialogue, which is precisely the kind of engagement we're all a part of tonight. Speaking of engagement, just some housekeeping details here. Over the course of our hour together, I would encourage you to add your own questions and insights by taking advantage of the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'll keep an eye on that and do our best to direct your comments towards Dr. Bickart during the question and answer period. You should also know that you can control the way in which you view the screen by clicking on the little view button at the top right corner. And that'll allow you to toggle back and forth between the big Brady Bunch screen and speaker view, which is probably going to be your best way to listen to the presentation itself. I think that's it. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sheila McGinn, Professor of Biblical Studies and Early Christianity, to introduce our main speaker and to help moderate tonight's conversation. Welcome and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hannenberg. As Ed said, my name is Sheila McGinn. I've been John Carroll for quite a while. I'm really delighted to introduce to you Dr. Noah Bickhardt, who is currently the director of the TUI Endowment for Interreligious Studies and also our assistant professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at John Carroll University. Dr. Bickart was born and raised in Washington, D.C., where his family was very involved in the Adas Israel congregation. He holds a BA in English Lit from the University of Chicago. Pretty rare for people to go as undergrads to the University of Chicago, so that tells you something about Dr. Bickart. There he focused on Jewish themes in James Joyce. So we have another point of contact there because Joyce being an Irish scholar. This is delightful for me. After a brief stint in the jazz recording industry in New York, Dr. Bickart studied Talmud at the Pardesh Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. He returned to America and enrolled at the Harvard Divinity School and earned an MA in Hebrew Bible in 2003. The following year, he entered the Rabbinical School at the Jewish Theological Seminary as a Wexner Graduate Fellow. After being ordained as a conservative rabbi in 2008, he remained at the Jewish Theological Seminary for doctoral work and received his PhD in 2015. After directing the Prosdor High School, the Eisenfeld Duker Beit Midrash, and teaching Talmud at the Rabbinical School for a few years, he became the Jacob and Hilda Blaustein Postdoctoral Fellow in the Program of Judaic Studies at Yale University, from which we snatched him in fall of 2018 and had him move to University Heights to join the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at John Carroll University. Dr. Bickart lives in Beechwood, Ohio with his wife, Nadia Khan, and their two children, Meir and Rena. So take it away, Dr. Bickart.
Thanks so much, Dr. McGinn. If I was snatched, it was largely because you snatched me. So I have you to thank for the snatching. People in the Jewish community frequently ask, sort of, what's it like to teach Jewish studies at a Christian university? Isn't that strange? And I actually have to answer and say, no, it's not strange at all. In fact, it's really exciting. And in part, that's because in many ways, as I've come to understand, Jewish studies really is a part of Catholic studies globally, and especially here at John Carroll. And so as Jews are preparing for Passover, actually tonight I'm going to clean my fridge when I get home after I'm done talking to you all. And Christians, of course, are preparing for Easter. Some of the kinds of parallel structures and systems of belief are really on display in ways that are maybe even more pronounced than they might normally be. And so tonight, what I want to try to do is sort of model for you some of the kinds of conversations that happen in the classroom, which used to happen in pre-COVID times in the department chair, in the department lounge, where the faculty and students and grad students sit around and talk about these things. It's actually, to answer this sort of basic question, it's a very exciting place to teach Jewish studies. It's a place where I can not only speak about history and the complicated development of ideas from within the Jewish tradition, but actually sort of broaden the lens and to speak theologically more broadly. And so it's a really wonderful place to try to do some of this kind of Jewish-Christian encounter that I'm going to try to do tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. And as I said before, if you look at the very top of the chat function, there is a PDF version of this source sheet. In case for some people, it's easier to deal with it from a PDF, or in case you want to print it out and use it at some point in your life. So the theme, the title of this talk, Signs and Wonders, comes from a passage in Deuteronomy 6. In many ways, Deuteronomy 6 is sort of the thesis statement of biblical Judaism. And these are verses which come up over and over and over again in the Passover Seder. Okay? When in the future your child asks you, what do the decrees, laws, and rules that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you mean? And Deuteronomy 6 is not explicitly about the laws of Passover, just more in general, the whole legal system, which is sort of the center of religion according to Deuteronomy. You shall say to your child, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. God performed before our eyes great signs and wonders in Egypt against Pharaoh and against all his household. So even from the biblical text itself, it seems to be clear that behind ideological pronouncements are props, are signs, are ways of showing in the physical world the ideology which sits behind them. And I want to talk about some of these signs tonight. But also there are wonders when it comes to thinking about these signs, how we use them, how the ideas behind them are expressed, and especially, I would argue, what is most wondrous in both traditions, in the way that both interpret the Hebrew Bible, is both in pointing out contradictions and in solving them. So I want to read Signs and Wonders as both props and this mode of identifying and answering questions. And let me give you a brief example of this. In another version of a very similar law, in which parents are instructed to teach their children about the Exodus, you have a little bit of a strange feature in the language. And it says, and you shall explain to your child on that day, it is because of this that God did for me when I went free from Egypt. Because of what is the sort of obvious question we want to ask. And the ancient midrash, the ancient rabbis, have a very clear and compelling read to that question, because of what? Because of this, the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael is probably a 3rd century document from the land of Israel, which is basically a line-by-line commentary on the book of Exodus. And it quotes this problematic passage, because of this. And they answer, when you have matzah and bitter herbs before you at your table. That is to say, it's as if we adopt the Midrash's reading of the biblical text, that the biblical text imagines that you're going to have props that help you explain things. And when do you have those props available to you? Well, obviously it's at the big Passover meal, at the Seder, when there are symbolic foodstuffs which really structure the whole event. Now, of course, you will have to note that there is something missing here. And of course, during the time when the temple still stood, before the year 70 CE or AD, however you think about it, it's not just matzah, and matzah meaning the unleavened bread of Passover, and the bitter herbs, which are meant, at least according to the rabbinic conception, to remind people of the bitter experience of Egypt. But of course, the actual real food stuff in biblical times, which is called in the Bible the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. And of course, it is absent here because for this midrash, post-biblical Judaism doesn't have the Paschal lamb. And in fact, this is why most Jews eat brisket on Passover, because specifically not to eat barbecue, just to make absolutely sure that nobody thinks that we're actually eating the sacrificial offering, which had to be barbecued. We'll return to a little bit of a discussion in the Christian context about the Paschal offering and how early Christianity thinks about it in a slightly different way. But what we do have in the Midrash is matzah, okay? And that is really the symbolic food of Passover. But if we need to do this kind of wondrous interpretation, the rabbis also note that the Bible is confusing when it talks about matzah. And in fact, there are multiple explanations for what the matzah is and what it means. And the first, sticking with Deuteronomy for a second, when Deuteronomy goes through the list of the biblical holidays, of course it includes Passover, and says, observe the month of Aviv. Okay, Aviv is a kind of grain, and offer a Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God. For it was in the month of Aviv at night that the Lord your God freed you from Egypt. You shall slaughter the Passover sacrifice for the Lord your God from the flock or the herd, okay, the smaller kinds of animals, sheep or goats, in the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish the divine name. This is Deuteronomy's sort of nickname for Jerusalem. You shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter, you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, this is the basic premise of Passover in the Bible, the Passover offering on the first night, and 7 days of eating unleavened bread. But why? What is that unleavened bread? And it says very explicitly in Hebrew, lechem oni, the bread of poor people. For you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, so that you remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live. It would seem from Deuteronomy that the meaning of the matzah is slave food, poor people's food. Right? So that's one explanation of what the matzah is. And a rather different one we find in the book of Exodus, and this is probably the more well-known biblical explanation of the matzah. And here in Exodus 12 is when the actual description of the Israelites leaving Egypt happens. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor they had prepared any provisions for themselves. And so we have these sort of two models of what the matzah is. Is it the bread that they ate in Egypt, poor people's bread? Or is it the bread that they ate when they left Egypt, free people's bread? There's this contradiction in the biblical text. Well, you have a lot of options in terms of how to harmonize difference and how to think about difference. And in this is, I talk to my students probably way too much about this, but this is among the things that Midrash attempts to answer, which is to assert that there are no contradictions in the biblical text as long as you know how to read them properly. And much of the time, Midrash occurs in text. But the Midrash around this bread can't only occur in text, it actually has to occur in action. And this is exactly how the rabbis who ordered the Seder put this together in such a way as to explain away this contradiction. At the very beginning of the Passover Seder, the door is thrown open, and this rather strange text in Babylonian Aramaic is read, Halachma anya di achalu av hatana ba'ara de Mitzrayim. Actually hold up the matzah and say, this is poor people's bread, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. And you can see here how much Deuteronomy has affected this text. Not only is it the Aramaic translation of lechem oni, lachma anya, even those who don't know Semitic languages can hear the similarity, but it says explicitly that they ate it in the land of Egypt. Okay? And that's Deuteronomy's model. Now, we don't eat the matzah at this point in the Seder. In fact, this is just the very beginning of telling the story. In fact, we interact with it as poor people's bread. The first thing one does with it is to split it in half and put some away for later, which is exactly the way that people who are food insecure behave. And yet, okay, by the very, very end of the Seder, when we've told the entire story and we've talked about the plagues and we've taken a little bit of wine from our cups and dipped it out of our cups in order to lessen our joy in thinking about the Egyptians who perished in the sea, when we finally get to eat the matzah, we have a radically different idea. And here, quoting again from the Passover Haggadah, at the very last moment before we eat the matzah, this is what is recited. Why do we eat this matzah? Because our ancestors did not have enough time for their bread to rise. So quickly did the most sovereign, blessed Holy One redeem them, as it is written explicitly talking about the verse in Exodus, and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt. So in a sense, the rabbinic answer, the way that the Seder ritual answers this contradiction, is it poor people's bread or is it free people's bread, is to say yes, right? It's both. At the beginning of the Seder, it begins as poor people's bread. But by the time we eat it, it's free people's bread. To sort of borrow a Catholic metaphor, right? The bread itself has become transubstantiated. It has changed in its meaning. And how has it changed in its meaning? Well, ritual has changed the meaning. By telling the story, by performing midrash, we change the meaning of the bread. And so by the time we actually eat it, we experience the freedom, and yet we have taken ourselves sort of on a journey of meaning from Deuteronomy and into Exodus. And so that's one way of sort of solving this kind of problem. And I personally find this very meaningful at the Seder, that through telling the story and through analyzing and through text, somehow the prop changes in its meaning. And the fact that we can have power over the meaning of that prop is rather fantastic. And so if we think about it this way, I think in some ways this can help us explain and engage with some New Testament texts as well. And again, the most exciting, I don't know about the most exciting, but among the most exciting pieces of my job is when Catholic students who have been engaged in their religious traditions their whole lives occasionally will study a text with me that they've seen and thought about their whole lives, and they see it in new meaning because now they know something about ancient Judean culture. That can be very, very exciting. If we think about some kinds of contradictions or challenges within the texts, well, the New Testament is full of them as well. And let me give you an example of this as well. So in the Gospel of Matthew, of course, Jesus and Jesus' disciples gather together to eat a Passover meal. It's not a Seder as we know it. Obviously, the Seder is a post-temple phenomenon. And what is described in the canonical Gospels is something like the procedure of eating the Passover meal while the temple still stood, including the Korban Pesach, including the Paschal Lamb. Okay, and here in maybe among the most famous texts of Matthew, in what most people think about as the Last Supper, on the eve of the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Okay, speaking explicitly about the Paschal Lamb. Okay, and in fact, they find a house and they join together to have the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12. Interesting to some degree. Perhaps one of the innovations of the Jesus movement is that teachers and disciples should have this meal together as opposed to families. We actually see some parallels to that in rabbinic material as well. While they were eating, Jesus took a piece of matzah. Of course, it must be unleavened bread. And after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So this notion that bread can change its meaning seems to be woven into the basic fabric of this meal. And if you sort of see this through the rabbinic parallels, then the notion of using the sign, using this prop, in order to tell a particular kind of story about salvation makes perfect sense. Okay. However, not all the Gospels talk about this meal in precisely the same way. And maybe most interestingly, or the way in which theologically, especially as I've come to learn in the Catholic Church, it's really John's Gospel. And John's understanding of the Passover and what it means, which has a really, really lasting theological effect on later Christianity. And for John, the important theology is that Jesus is the Passover. Not that Jesus ate the Passover, but that Jesus is the Passover. And you can see this very clearly how John is reading Exodus, okay? As part of Exodus's analysis or instruction of how to eat the Passover, right? The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the law of the Passover offering. No foreigner shall eat of it, but any slave a man has bought may eat of it," etc. Right? "You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break a bone of it." Right? The Passover offering has to be spit roast and barbecued and not chopped up first. Well, if this is true, of course, for John, the chronology therefore has to be different. And the meal that Jesus eats with the disciple is not a Passover meal with matzah, but rather the night before, at least in my conception of my week this week, right? Passover Seder is Saturday night. It was if that meal would be Friday night where people are still eating bread. We'll probably eat our bread on our back porch on paper dishes and then come in and eat on our Passover dishes, but the principle still obtains. Okay? Since it was the day of preparation, the Jews did not want bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because that Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Okay? Why? These things occurred so that scripture might be fulfilled, nor shall you break a bone of it. John is making very clear in some way that the prop, given my structure, right, the actual paschal lamb has now been replaced, and Jesus's death, Jesus's sacrifice, as it were, is in place of, stands for the Korban Pesach, for the sacrificial lamb. And so we have a little bit of a contradiction here within the Gospels. This is, of course, well known. That for the Synoptic Gospels, as in Matthew quoted above, that Last Supper is a Passover meal. And the matzah is the core prop that needs explanation and can change its meaning. And for John, that meal which took place the night before was not a Passover meal. And in fact, the core prop in the story is the Paschal lamb, which needs explanation and understanding. I was really encouraged. At some point, I actually went to Dr. Hannenberg and said, "Okay, Dr. Hannenberg, you know everything about Catholic theology. How do I start teaching about contradictions in the biblical text? Right? I don't want my students to be surprised that their Jewish professor comes at them and starts explaining about contradictions in the Bible." He says, "I have just the book for you. Right? If Pope Benedict can acknowledge that, then you can too." And he was kind enough to send me a piece of the previous Pope's account of this. Okay, and I'll read it for you. In the evangelist's accounts of this event, there seems to be a contradiction between the version as told by John and those of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. According to John, Christ died on the cross at the exact moment when in the temple nearby, the lambs were being slaughtered for the Paschal feast. His death coincides with the sacrifice of the lambs. That, however, means he died on the eve of Passover and therefore could not personally celebrate the Paschal feast. This, at least, is what seems to be. I would argue, therefore, the Pope is now doing midrash, precisely as the Mechilta did, trying to explain away with a sort of theological response to a biblical challenge. Okay? According to the other evangelists, our Lord's Supper was a traditional Paschal feast into which he inserted the novelty of the gift of his body and blood. Until very recently, this contradiction seemed irresolvable. Most of the exegetes were of the opinion that John did not want to give us the exact historic date of Christ's death, but had instead chose a symbolic date to highlight the one profound truth, right? This is much of what I was saying with a slightly different valence before. And he goes on to explain that perhaps what is going on is actually a result of knowledge that we now know from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there were Judeans in this time period who were already having a feast on a different date without the lamb, because they disagreed with the notion of the temple, or they thought that the temple was being run by the wrong people, etc. And so, at least according to Pope Benedict, the meal happened the night before and was not a matzah-based meal, or maybe it was a matzah-based meal because they thought of a slightly different date of the Passover. And yet, simultaneously, Jesus could be the Passover. And so I think what we see going on here is an acknowledgement of both of these traditions, which are based on the Hebrew Bible and which seek to update and to apply those biblical metaphors to changing tradition as it moves forward. We see very similar modes of approach despite the very obvious differences. Jews, of course, don't have anything to do with Jesus at their Seder. And theologically speaking, not only for Jews is Jesus not the Passover, Jesus is not part of God. This is an irrevocable difference that Christians and Jews have. And yet, we see that the props, as I call them, the foodstuffs, these symbolic foods, are marshaled in order to create metaphors that have deep and profound meanings for people who celebrate these traditions. And I think it can be very exciting to see how others utilize these symbols in different ways. You can see what might have been, or other options, or other opportunities. And you can also see how really thoughtful religious engagement with ancient texts is an attempt to explain contradictions through ritual. And I think this is the kind of lesson that especially contemporary Jews and contemporary Catholics can learn from each other. Maybe more so than any other religious groups in America, Jews and Catholics are deeply invested in their rituals and their meanings. And when you study them together, all kinds of sort of exciting possibilities arise. So at this point, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to invite my senior colleague, Dr. McGinn, to respond and maybe ask some questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bickart. I was trying to follow the questions along here. We don't have too many yet, so feel free to please add what other comments you might have. This comparison that you're making between sort of Benedict's, if you will, midrash on the texts of in this case, the New Testament, which of course are already doing reflection and perhaps an element of midrash on the Hebrew Bible texts. We've got these layers of layers. It feels sort of like one of those Russian dolls, you know, where you keep opening more and more layers. This is one you probably have thought about, but you didn't mention in your talk in regard to this, where Jesus is doing an interpretation of the text. This is the Johannine Jesus again. And on the last and greatest day of the feast, which I'm kind of assuming was an earlier Passover, because as you know, in John, Jesus' ministry is not 1 year long. It's actually at least 3, perhaps 4 years long. He makes 3 pilgrimage trips to Jerusalem. And so that Last Supper may or may not actually be a Passover. It's not the regular Passover time that everybody else would have celebrated. but definitely he celebrated other Passovers earlier. Anyway, on the greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood up and exclaimed, "Let anyone who thirsts come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me," as scripture says, "rivers of living water will flow through him." Now, of course, he's quoting Isaiah 55 there, "Though everyone who thirsts come to the water," but he's spinning it, of course, or John is spinning it in the mouth of Jesus there, that actually, no, you don't get the water from the rock in the desert, you get the water from Jesus. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think the parallels are really exciting. Usually in rabbinic texts, the water is seen as a symbol for Torah, right? The sort of abstract notion of the content of Jewish study as that which nourishes people. And I think this fits very, very nicely into John's theology. Jesus, of course, is the logos, for the word for John, and many other scholars have tried to think about the way in which early rabbinic texts talk about the Torah as an abstract idea, maybe even an abstract idea that existed before creation, that God used in the creation of the universe. Which sounds to those who know the prologue of John to be incredibly resonant there. So I think that's another wonderful parallel that makes perfect sense. You can see how the rabbis are moving in one direction in that metaphor from Isaiah, and John is moving in a different but a parallel direction in that way. And then yet another thing, this notion of all who are thirsty, let them come and drink, is directly parallel to this strange Aramaic text, which the Haggadah begins with, called Dichvin Yete V'Yechol. Anybody who is hungry, let them come and eat. It's interesting that the rabbis in the Haggadah, right, that becomes literal, not figurative, where again the door is thrown open, and we say, "Hey, anybody need a meal?" Right? Come. I always used to ask my parents, sort of, what would happen if someone showed up at that moment and said, "Oh yeah, I'm hungry. Could we come in?" Would we actually let them in? Would we invite them in? How would we deal with it? But I think that that's yet another example of how we see real difference, significant difference, and yet kind of parallel working within different sources. I'm really encouraged to hear you say this about the sort of broader chronology. It's always been a problem for me, and we talked about this when we talked about the Paula Fredrickson book, right? The notion that Jesus shows up in Jerusalem having never been there before, and suddenly the authorities are angry or prepared. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you adopt John's chronology, then it makes sense. This movement has been there before. And this is not there for the first time, and there's a much longer story there. And again, this is a really sort of exciting way to think about theological difference between different sources, and then how one harmonizes them and how one makes meaning out of that difference is sort of what this is all about.
Thank you. So one of the questions has to do with Passover being a family meal, not an all-male meal, and in the Gospels, then, like, where are the women? Because nobody talks about them. You mentioned earlier about this being a meal with disciples. I don't think that necessarily answers the question, though. So could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure. So there are two relatively old rabbinic accounts of what we might call the Passover Seder. One is in the Mishnah, which is really the earliest core rabbinic document, redacted sometime around the year 200, and also a sort of companion volume, the Tosefta. And most people think that the Tosefta, which by its very name, which means addition or something like that, assume that the Tosefta is a commentary on or later than the Mishnah. And the Mishnah tends to imagine that there are children at the Passover meal. And if there isn't enough knowledge on the part of the children, then the sage's wife asks him. So this is sort of a family meal. And in the Tosefta's version of this, it seems that it's an all-male situation and really one of disciples. And among the biggest issues in rabbinic studies is the relationship between the Mishnah and the Tosefta. And in fact, much of the methodology of comparing the Mishnah and the Tosefta is taken directly from New Testament studies. The same synoptic problem of when I compare two texts and they look very, very similar, but yet one must be dependent on the other, or vice versa, trying to establish which is the source and which is the one that borrows from that source. This is exactly what scholars of rabbinics apply to those texts. And the dominant theory these days is many times that the Tosefta actually predates the Mishnah in certain kinds of places. And so my teacher, Shama Yehuda Friedman, argued about this, that there was actually a transition from earlier rabbinic traditions to the Mishnah. We're talking about first and very early 2nd century transition, that what had started out in terms of disciple circleships, actually the rabbis decided to change this from an all-male disciple situation to one in which the families are present. And it seems to be by design on a part of the redactors of the Mishnah to sort of transfer this ritual from one of teacher and disciples to families in which women and children are present. And it may well be that therefore some of the New Testament texts might be capturing something closer to the Tosefta, which then is, we see the process of development there.
That's really interesting, because of course my read of the New Testament would be they just didn't talk about the girls. Jesus had women disciples, and for the most part, the women only get talked about when the men are off the scene. So the women were there at the meal, but they don't get named because they're not part of the, because conflict happens at that meal. And it's a power struggle that takes place at that last meal. And so the women are not involved in the power struggle, which is kind of interesting. But all that you said in terms of this historical development, I think is kind of interesting. And clearly what we do have going on that's different, I think, at least initially in the Jesus movement, is that that in his day, it was still a practice that this was a family meal, except perhaps at Qumran, where you have a different sort of fictive kinship kind of relationship going on. But in the Jesus movement, you do have this fictive kinship, and he tells people that they have to leave their natural family behind if they want to become a disciple. So he rejects the boundaries of natural family, and in fact is actually fairly rude to his own mother and siblings if you follow the Gospel of Mark. And so this fictive kinship reality is definitely among disciples. Now, my view is that, okay, but the disciples were male and female, not just male, but the men, the men get all the press. But
you could play this game in Qumran as well. I mean, most of the texts from Qumran imagine an all-male society. And yet Talilan went and did the bone analysis of many of the skeletons found at Qumran and found that 45% of them were women. Now, there's always a problem of, are the texts and the community is exactly the same people, or is it not? But it's possible that the producers of texts may write women out of situations in which they very clearly were there. And who knows, I mean, what you're talking about in terms of Mark may well be about Qumran as well. Wouldn't that be another really interesting model in which these sort of three traditions are operating in similar kinds of ways?
Yeah, okay, well, maybe for another day, huh? We'll do Qumran. Someone asked if or when the temple is rebuilt, will the Passover meal change drastically?
Good question. So this, I mean, the obvious answer is, I don't know, and neither does anybody else. And when the Messiah of whichever stripe shows up for the first time or the second time, then we'll figure it out and we'll get the answer. This is a hotly debated topic in the medieval Jewish sources. Maimonides is famous for insisting that the Third Temple will be purely vegetarian. And he is roundly criticized for this because, of course, you might imagine that in the Messianic age, when the temple is rebuilt and the cultic service is returned to Jerusalem, well, it should function the way it did in antiquity. Now, of course, Ezekiel's model of the Third Temple may be slightly different, and we could think about that as well. But there is this notion of progress and change, and Maimonides is sort of interesting this way. Certainly, certain streams of Jewish vegetarianism have really latched onto this, as if there's an ideal of vegetarianism which might be re-established in the time of the Third Temple. This is also something I find myself talking to my students a great deal about. Sort of many of these ultimate questions of what happens when you die and what will exist in the future, and these sort of deep theological concerns in many ways are not quite as pressing in Rabbinic Judaism as they are sometimes in Christianity. Rabbinic Judaism tends to focus on the law of here and now, and the Jewish schiza, when they happen, tends to happen based on whether this food is kosher or it isn't, or whether this activity is permitted on the Sabbath or it isn't, etc., as opposed to these sort of broader theological questions in which the rabbis are sort of happy to agree to disagree about the sort of theoretical formulation. So I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll hold out for revelation on that point. I have a question for you. You were talking about the matzah as the bread of the poor, and then the bread of freedom, and the way this trans-signification, if you will, the way the meaning of that sign changes in a wondrous way. And then you were relating it, of course, to the way that continues to be transmuted or transsignified in some of the New Testament material. But I'm focusing on the part about the bread of the poor. And you mentioned also the open door during Passover, that anybody's welcome. Last week, as you probably know, was the feast of darn it, I'm losing my mind here. Saint Joseph. We have, Patrick and Joseph together. And the thing about the Feast of St. Joseph in Italian tradition, in Catholic Italian tradition at least, is that you have a St. Joseph table. And that's the day you leave the door open. Okay. And everybody's welcome. And usually the table is filled with food that's kind of poor fare. The kind of fare that poor people would eat. There's lots of pasta because, it's Italian. And there's also, not like sweet cake, expensive things, but kind of normal bread, if you will. And I don't know that there's any connection between the St. Joseph table tradition and the Passover tradition about leaving the door open, but the two, feature the same kind of function there. So I'm wondering about this notion of the bread of the poor, which certainly is what's going on in John 6 in the feeding of the multitude,
right,
where nobody can afford to go eat. So Jesus multiplies the food that they have. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship between this basic justice question about who gets to eat, and how these two how these multiple ways of signifying bread
function? That's a really good question. So in terms of the door opening, unfortunately, I think that the real answer of the door enters later, and it's really a response to the blood libel.
Yeah.
It's a way of saying, hey, non-Jewish community, there's nothing untoward going on in our houses, and come look. And in some ways that you can track this, because there are rabbinic authorities who start allowing one to use white wine at the Seder because of concerns of blood being used or things like that. And there would be no worry about blood if everyone's using white wine. Some people argue with that and actually have tried to trace the history of good white wine. Apparently, until the 14th or 15th century, there's no such thing as really good, fancy white wine. and that it's really only at the time period in which fancy white wine appears on the scene that people start using the wine. In terms of the sort of quality of the food, among the issues, of course, is that in addition to it being Passover, it's a holiday. It's a Yom Tov, and Yom Tov food has to be the best food you've got. That same Maimonides thinks that until the temple is rebuilt, one has to eat meat on Yom Tov, and has to drink wine on Yom Tov, because one is supposed to be happy, and the way that you're happy is by eating fancy food and drinking fancy wine, and that's the way to do it. So I'm not sure, by the time you actually get to eat the food it's a feast, and it's fancy food and things like that. In many ways, it's only a prop. It's only poor people's food when it's utilized as a prop, because so much of the Seder is demonstrating freedom. And in fact, the way the rabbis signal that is this whole leaning thing, reclining, which probably has its roots in Greco-Roman symposium culture. But the rabbis take that as a symbol of how free people eat, and insist that all of the foodstuffs be consumed in that manner. So it's maybe ironic that even though it's held up as a prop and it's played with as poor people's bread, it's not really interacted very much with as poor people's bread. The other thing, of course, is that in the ancient world, and I was thinking about this as we're thinking about loaves and fishes and things like that, only in Egypt is there big puffy bread. Everywhere else in the ancient Near East, as anyone who's traveled in the modern Middle East knows, is they don't have big puffy bread, right? They have pita bread or laffa bread or ashtanor or whatever it is that you call it. That classic Bedouin bread where you put the rock in the fire and you wait till it gets hot and you take it out and you put your dough on it and it cooks very quickly. That's probably what matzah was in antiquity. And nobody had the big kind of leavened bread. And so it may well be that matzah has a sort of earlier connotation of not Egyptian bread. And also in the temple, there's basically no leavened bread. Only the lechem hapanim, the shoe bread, is leavened. All the rest of the bread in the temple is unleavened bread. And so in many ways, and Dr. Hannenberg and I have this wonderful chavruta on the Psalms on Fridays, where we study the Psalms in a pair. And we were thinking about this, I forget what it was, Psalm 127 or Psalm 27, I think, in thinking about the temple as this sort of idealized version of reality. Well, if there's only unleavened bread in the temple, then in some ways the Passover Seder, of course, with the Exodus connotation and everything, in many ways it's also sort of looking at the temple as well, and that may be another valence of the food, of what the food means.
Thank you. Another question that's come up is, could you speak a little bit of the differences between Jewish meals and pagan meals in the first century? This person's interested in how the meal functions as a context for early Eucharistic practice.
Good. I think it's actually Dr. Hannenberg who's asking that question.
I was not ratting him out, but yes, it looks like.
Sure. Well, I think, in many ways, the rabbis, especially in the Mishnah, among the ways that they seek to reimagine the Passover meal in a time when the temple no longer stands and where the eating of the sacrificial lamb is no longer part of it, they look around to the broader culture and they are aware of the Greco-Roman symposium, right? For those of you who know anything about Plato, right? The symposium is where the rich, fancy Romans get around and have a meal in which there's a topic of conversation, some sort of theory that should entertain them. In Plato's symposium, the topic is love. And so they take turns giving speeches about the meaning of love. And the rabbis say, aha, this is perfect. We can do that too. Our symposium will be about the Exodus and our topic will be the Exodus. And I think this is a good example of how rabbinic culture is not cloistered and separate from the broader Greco-Roman world. It's deeply influenced by it. And the rabbis sort of latch on to this particular kind of practice and say, oh yeah, we can do that too. And it sort of makes sense. This is a time period, especially after the destruction of the temple, in which one response to that tragedy is to sort of relinquish core Judean identity. Another of my teachers, Seth Schwartz, has argued extensively that the rabbis of the second and early third century encounter Judea, which is largely devoid of traditional Jewish practice. And in some ways, traditional Judaism has to be reinvented for that population. And part of the way the rabbis do it, and I think part of the genius and part of the reason why it was adopted so well, is because they took this piece of the surrounding culture, adopted it, shifted it, gave it a particular Jewish kind of meaning, and then ran with it. So much so that your average 21st century Jewish person in Cleveland leans at their Seder having no notion of a Greco-Roman meal. We sit in chairs, we don't lie on cushions, and yet everybody does this sort of thing on Passover, and it's this vestigial form of Greco-Roman eating practice. Just a brief story. My grandmother, Aleha Hashalom, was a real stickler for posture. She would always make me sit up and keep my neck in a certain way. But on Passover, I would slouch and I could sort of stare at her and say, not tonight, Grandma, right? I can slouch. You have to slouch on Passover. So for me, obnoxious kid, it was more about telling my grandmother not to tell me what to do and less, but really I was performing Greco-Roman eating practice. So I think that's part of what's going on.
This is totally not really related to what you've been talking about, but since you were talking about Greco-Roman eating practices, in my class yesterday, we were talking about the beloved disciple reclining on Jesus' breast at the last meal in the Gospel according to John. And so I was trying to explain what that was all about and the whole thing with the dining couches and stuff like that, and how much space it would take if you had to have a dining room that fit 9 of those couches. Nobody has space or not nobody, but most people do not have space like that chairs and tables are much more economical.
Yeah. The Talmud has a long discussion about exactly how disciples are supposed to sit at the Seder in their master's presence. It's interesting how things come in and out of the tradition. What may have moved from a disciple tradition towards a more family meal in the later Talmudic period in Babylonia, it seems like they're all having their meals with their masters. And because it wouldn't be respectful to lean in the presence of your master, they lean on each other's knees. At least that's what said Rava, who is a Babylonian sage of maybe the 4th century, says that he remembers what they used to do in their teachers' houses. They would lean on each other's knees, and then the Talmud says that's ridiculous. You're allowed to recline in front of your master. But so this notion of leaning on other people seems to continue to be a part of this ritual, or at least it's part of the discussion. It'd be interesting to see how some of these practices, which originate in the Hellenized West, move across the world. In the Eastern Persian orbit, many of these Hellenistic ideas are moving across Sasanian Persia at the same period that Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity are moving into that area. And so it's interesting to sort of see these adaptations of traditional Greco-Roman practices in places like, pretty far away from, really far away from Rome, certainly.
Okay, somebody asked about, okay, so a little backup. In the Catholic tradition, the Eucharistic meal is central to the weekly gathering and the liturgy. Arguably, this is an extension of the Greco-Roman symposium tradition. Okay. Was this tradition also part of contemporary Jewish culture at that time?
Well, yes and no. Certainly not with the matzah, but Sabbath meals also have a blessing over wine. And a blessing over bread, and the wine and the bread are part of every Sabbath meal. It is the standard sort of ritual that's performed at the Sabbath table, both on Friday nights and on Saturday mornings. And in many ways, this is explicitly explained in Talmudic sources as a replacement for the temple. For example, Leviticus insists, Kol korbanecha takriv melach. Every offering shall be salted. So that every Jewish Sabbath table has a salt container, and the bread is dipped in the salt and passed out, and it is as if the bread at the Sabbath meal table, it stands in place of the temple. This is how at least 2 tractates of the Talmud finish, which is to say that when the temple still stood, the sacrifices performed forgiveness for people, and now that the temple is destroyed, it's a person's table which stands in place of the altar. And there are a number of sort of pseudo-priestly behaviors which are performed. There's a ritual washing of the hands before the, I'm doing this because it's like what the doctors do, right? That's kind of the metaphor. But in many ways, that weekly Sabbath ritual around bread and wine might also be a nice parallel. And in that way, the Passover Seder, yes, it's different because the bread is not leavened, and most in the dominant tradition, you have 3 matzahs as opposed to the normal 2 loaves of challah bread that you would have at a regular meal. But in many ways, it is a weekly ritual.
Okay, somebody's accusing Paul of being a problem, but we're not going to talk about him tonight. We'll save him for our April conversation. And I think we have actually covered all the questions that have to do with your particular topic for tonight. The one thing that came up that we haven't talked about has to do with Jesus' cry, the last words on the cross in the gospel according to Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is the opening line of, well, Psalm 21 or 22, depending on which, enumeration you're following. I don't know if you want to talk about that for 1 minute.
I mean, I don't know a lot about it. Of course, it's reproduced. One of the few things that's reproduced in good Galilean Aramaic in the Gospels, Abba, Abba, Lama, Sabatani, right? So the sort of Aramaic piece is there. I don't really have a lot to say about its exegesis, other than this just sort of plea for those of us to really think about the various dialects of Aramaic as maybe the most important place where Jewish and Christian scholars can come together, especially in the study of Syriac. A lot of what we've been talking about tonight is in what I think of as the West, in Roman Palestine, where it's Greek as the dominant other language. But most of my own scholarly interests occur in the East, in which Jewish Babylonian Aramaic and Christian Syriac are the dominant languages. I actually learned Syriac basically because I already knew Babylonian. I found that if I learned the alphabet, I could basically read these Christian martyrdom tales without actually using a different set of dictionaries, because the languages are simply so close. And this opens up all kinds of parallels between Jewish and Christian thought. It happens all the time. It's very easy to uncover polemics. It's easy to uncover borrowings and interchange. And as much as the Roman West has the sort of beginnings both of rabbinic Judaism and of Christianity, in some ways it's really the Sasanian Persian context which is the best model for Jewish-Christian dialogue in antiquity, because Jews and Christians were equals as minority religions in the Sasanian sphere, and in many ways it's like Jews and Catholics in America, right? We're kind of normal like everybody else, and yet we're also kind of different. And that kind of both sort of fitting in and also not quite fitting in is really exciting to see that this is not the first time in history that Jews and Christians have found themselves in this kind of situation. In fact, during the Talmudic period, during the time of Afrahat and Ephraim and other Eastern church fathers, a great deal of this has gone on instead. So basically my response to the question is those words are in Aramaic and we should really dig deep into Aramaic. Dr. Hannenberg, I think is...
Okay.
I knew that my hardest job tonight would be interrupting this conversation. Said I would. Can you please, all of you, join me in thanking both Dr. Bickart and Dr. McGinn for a great conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us, spending some time with us this evening. We'll do it again. And if you signed up for tonight, we'll let you know about it when it's happening. So thanks for being with us. And I would say to all of you, have a very happy Easter. Chag Sameach. Until next time.